He glanced at me, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Thanks. For the first time in a long while I didn't feel invisible. It wasn't long before Luke and I became inseparable. He'd wait for me after class, walk me home and send me texts late into the night. With him I didn't feel like too much. He seemed to like the parts of me I usually tried to hide. The nervous energy, the endless questions, the way I'd get lost in my own thoughts. Our first date wasn't anything fancy. He took me to the park where we sat on a blanket under the stars, sharing a bag of chips and talking about everything and nothing. I feel like I've known you forever, I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. Luke looked at me, his expression soft. Maybe you have. Maybe we're just finding each other again. The way he said it made me shiver, like he'd reached into my chest and touched something fragile and hidden. That night he kissed me. It wasn't my first kiss, but it was the first one that felt real. His lips were soft, his hands gentle as they cradled my face. For a moment the emptiness inside me seemed to fade, replaced by something warm and fleeting.
Welcome to Psych Tales. Whether you're returning for more or here for the first time, you're in the perfect place to explore psychological disorders through captivating stories. If you enjoy learning about psychology in a simple, engaging, and entertaining way, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Let's dive in.
The knife on the kitchen counter gleamed under the dim fluorescent light. I wasn't going to use it, not today, at least. But I liked having it there, a silent companion to my thoughts. There was something comforting about the weight of it, the cool metal against my skin. It reminded me that I was still alive, even if most days I wished I wasn't. There isn't a word for what I feel. Not really. Doctors and books have their terms: disorder, dysfunction, pathology, but they don't capture the truth. The truth is messier, more jagged. Some days, it feels like I'm drowning in emotions I can't name. Other days, I feel nothing at all. The clock ticked softly on the wall. 3:47 a.m. sleep, and I had been on bad terms for years now. Nights like this were the worst, when the silence pressed in so heavily I couldn't breathe, and every thought in my head felt too loud, too sharp. I reached for my journal, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. Most of it was a chaotic mess, half-finished thoughts, angry scrawls, words etched so hard into the paper they tore through. I never let anyone see it. Not that anyone would care to. One entry stopped me. January 15th. I think I scared him away. Again. Why do I always do this? Why can't I just be normal? Mark. The last man I'd tried to love. Or maybe the last man I'd begged to love me. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. I met him at a bookstore, of all places. He had this easy smile, the kind that felt warm even from across the room. When he asked me out for coffee, I thought, this is it. This is the one who's going to save me. But no one ever saves me. They just leave. The night it ended is burned into my memory. I'd spent hours cooking dinner, carefully plating everything like I was auditioning for a life I'd never have. I told myself it had to be perfect. If it was perfect, maybe he'd stay. But he was late. Traffic, he'd said. The words didn't matter. All I heard was, "You're not worth it. Do I even matter to you?" I'd snapped the moment he walked through the door. My voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut. He looked startled. Then hurt. "Susan, it was traffic. I texted you." But it wasn't about the traffic. It never was. It was about the way his lateness made me feel invisible, unimportant. And once the spiral started, there was no stopping it. By the end of the night, he was gone, and I was alone again, sitting at a table full of untouched food. I closed the journal, my hand trembling. The knife on the counter caught my eye again. I wasn't going to use it. But the thought was there, hovering at the edges of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. There's a part of me that wonders if I'll ever be free of this chaos, this emptiness, this need. And then there's another part, quieter but insistent, that tells me I don't deserve to be. I was 7 when I learned how to disappear. Not literally, of course. I was always there, in the background, a quiet shadow in a house that was always too loud. But emotionally, that was different. My mother used to call me too sensitive. It wasn't a compliment. She said it like it was a defect, a thing I should have outgrown, like my baby teeth or my childhood stutter. I learned to hide my feelings early on. Crying got me scolded, anger got me ignored. The only way to survive was to be small, invisible. But there was one person I couldn't hide from, my father. He had a voice like thunder, a temper that struck without warning. I don't remember much about him that wasn't tied to fear. The slamming of doors, the sharp smell of whiskey, the way he'd look at me sometimes like I was a problem he didn't know how to fix. There was a night, it's one of the few memories I can't seem to block out, when I overheard him yelling at my mother. "She's just like you," he spat. Overdramatic. Weak. I didn't understand what he meant then. But I do now. He saw himself in me, too. The chaos, the anger, the need for control. And he hated it. It was Christmas Eve, the year I turned 9. My little brother Ethan and I were sitting by the tree, staring at the twinkling lights. The air smelled like pine and cinnamon, but it was too quiet. "Do you think Santa will come?" Ethan whispered, his wide brown eyes fixed on me. I nodded. Of course. He always does. But I wasn't so sure. The argument between my parents had started hours ago, and the shouting still echoed faintly from upstairs. A crash interrupted our whispered conversation. My mother's voice followed, sharp and furious. "Get out, Frank. Just get out." Ethan flinched, clutching the edge of his blanket. "Is Daddy leaving?" "I don't know," I admitted. We waited there for hours, watching the lights blink on and off, on and off. Eventually, Ethan fell asleep, his head resting against my shoulder. I stayed awake, listening to the silence that followed my father's exit, feeling a weight settle in my chest that I wouldn't understand for years. The morning after that Christmas Eve, the house felt different. Not quieter, our house was never truly quiet, but hollow, like something important had been taken away and no one wanted to acknowledge it. The presents under the tree were still there, untouched. Ethan tugged at my sleeve as I stood in the doorway, watching my mother sip coffee at the kitchen table. She looked tired, her hair a frayed halo around her face, her eyes darkened by something heavier than exhaustion. "Is Daddy coming back?" Ethan asked softly. Mom didn't answer right away. She just stared into her mug like it held some secret she was trying to decipher. Finally, she said, "Eat your breakfast. Santa doesn't bring toys to kids who don't eat." I knew better than to push. Ethan didn't. But enough. The word cracked like a whip, making both of us flinch. Ethan's bottom lip trembled, and he shrank behind me. I wanted to say something, to comfort him or maybe even yell at her for making him cry, but I didn't. Instead, I took his hand and led him to the living room. That was the first time I realized that adults lie, not just to protect you, but to protect themselves. My father didn't come back that day. Or the next. Or the week after that. It was around this time that I invented Anna. Anna was everything I wasn't. Bold. Fearless. Confident. She didn't cry when people yelled or flinch when doors slammed. She didn't stay quiet when someone hurt her. At first, she only existed in my head, a voice that told me what to say or do when I felt like I couldn't handle the world. But soon, she became more real, at least to me. I talked to her in whispers when I was alone in my room, imagining her sitting cross-legged on my bed, her dark curls bouncing as she nodded along to my ramblings. "You're stronger than you think," she'd say. "I don't feel strong." "You don't have to feel it. You just have to fake it." Anna helped me survive those years. She told me to hold my head high when the kids at school teased me for wearing hand-me-down clothes. She told me to smile when my mother snapped at me or when Ethan cried because he missed Dad. But sometimes, Anna wasn't so kind. "You're being weak," she'd hiss when I cried alone at night. "No one's going to save you. You have to save yourself." She was my protector, but she was also my tormentor. My father came back 6 months later. It was a Friday evening. I remember the way the golden light streamed through the windows, making everything look warm and peaceful. My mother was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she stirred a pot of soup. Ethan and I were playing with a set of mismatched building blocks in the living room. The sound of the front door opening startled all of us. "Frank," my mother called, her voice tentative. "Who else would it be?" he replied, his voice heavy with irritation. Ethan jumped up, a wide smile spreading across his face. "Daddy!" He ran to the door, throwing his arms around our father's legs. For a moment, I thought I saw something soft in my dad's eyes as he looked down at my brother. But then he looked up at my mother and the softness disappeared. "We need to talk," he said. The fight started almost immediately. They didn't even try to hide it this time. "Do you think you can just waltz back in here like nothing happened?" Mom snapped, her voice shaking with anger. "I'm still their father," Dad shot back. "You can't just cut me out. You cut yourself out the moment you walked out that door." Ethan clung to me, his small hands gripping my arm tightly. I could feel his little body trembling and I tried to block out the shouting, but it was impossible. "I'm not doing this here," Dad finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'll be back for my things." He left again that night. Ethan cried himself to sleep and I stayed awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. Anna didn't say anything. For once she was as silent as I was. Life didn't return to normal after that. Not that it ever was normal to begin with. My mother grew quieter, more withdrawn. She spent her evenings sitting by the window, staring out at the street like she was waiting for someone who would never come. Ethan stopped asking about Dad after a while. But I could see the hurt in his eyes whenever Father's Day rolled around, or when one of his friends talked about going fishing with their dad. As for me, I tried to keep it together. For Ethan's sake. For Mom's. But something inside me had started to crack. I didn't know how to describe it back then, but now I think of it as a kind of emptiness. A hollow ache that no amount of love or attention could fill. I wanted to be loved, desperately, but I didn't trust it. I was a walking contradiction. Longing for connection but terrified of it. Craving affection but pushing people away the moment they got too close. Even Anna couldn't make sense of it. "You're broken," she whispered one night as I lay awake in bed. "But that's okay. You don't need anyone else. You have me." And for a while that was enough. The years between childhood and adolescence blurred together. A monotonous cycle of school, chores, and quiet resentment. By the time I turned 13, my father was a ghost, my mother was a stranger, and Ethan was the only anchor I had left. But anchors don't last forever. Ethan, always sweet and eager to please, started pulling away from me. He stopped asking me to play board games or help with his homework. Instead, he spent more time in his room, headphones clamped over his ears, drowning out the world. I wanted to be angry with him for leaving me behind. But how could I blame him when I wanted to escape too? I was starting to realize how small my world was. The same house, the same faces at school, the same unspoken rules about what could and couldn't be said. And then, seemingly overnight, my body began to change and so did everything else. The first thing I noticed was how people started looking at me differently. Boys who used to ignore me suddenly paid attention. Girls who once teased me about my clothes now whispered behind my back, their eyes darting to the curves I didn't know what to do with. At first, I thought it was a good thing. I'd spent so much of my childhood feeling invisible that the attention felt intoxicating. But it didn't take long for it to turn sour. It was the spring of my freshman year when I went to my first school dance. I wore a dress my mom had picked out, a cheap pale blue thing that didn't quite fit right, but I didn't care. I wasn't going for the dress. I was going for the chance to feel like I belonged. When I walked into the gym, the music was loud and the air was thick with the smell of cheap cologne and sweat. I stood near the bleachers, clutching a cup of punch, trying to pretend I wasn't terrified. "Hey, Susan." I turned to see Jake, a boy from my math class. He had one of those lopsided grins that made you feel like he was sharing a secret with you. "You look nice," he said, leaning against the wall beside me. For a moment I couldn't speak. No boy had ever said that to me before. "Thanks," I mumbled, my cheeks burning. He asked me to dance and I said yes. The gym seemed to fade away as we moved to the music, his hands resting lightly on my waist. For the first time in years I felt seen. But then as the song ended, he leaned in close and whispered, "Wanna get out of here?" Something in his tone made my stomach twist. I didn't know what he meant, but I knew it wasn't good. I should stay," I stammered, stepping back. His grin faltered and for a moment his eyes turned cold. "Whatever," he muttered, walking away without another word. I spent the rest of the night sitting alone by the bleachers, watching the other kids laugh and dance, wondering what I'd done wrong. It was around this time that I discovered another way to cope. It started small, a scratch here, a scrape there. Nothing serious. But each time the sharp sting brought a strange sense of relief, like I was releasing something trapped inside me. One night, after an argument with my mom about my grades, I locked myself in the bathroom and pressed the blade of a razor against my skin. I didn't plan to go deep, just enough to feel something other than the rage and emptiness that had been building inside me all day. When I saw the thin red line appear, a calmness washed over me. It was the first time in months that I felt in control. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like I was trying to die. It was just a release, a way to quiet the chaos in my head. But it didn't stay small. High school friendships were like quicksand, easy to fall into but impossible to hold on to. I met Emily during my sophomore year. She was loud and unapologetic, everything I wanted to be. She took me under her wing, inviting me to parties and introducing me to people who would never have noticed me otherwise. For a while it felt like I'd found my place. But Emily had a temper and it didn't take much to set her off. One minute we'd be laughing and the next she'd be screaming at me over something I didn't understand. "You're so clingy, Susan," she snapped one day after I asked why she hadn't called me back. "You need to chill." Her words hit like a slap and I spent the rest of the day crying in the girls' bathroom. By the end of the week we were friends again, but the cracks in our relationship never really healed. I clung to her because I didn't know how to be alone, and she kept me around because she liked having someone to control. By the middle of sophomore year, I'd learned one thing about friendship. It wasn't stable. Emily was still in my life but barely. Our arguments grew more frequent, each one leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. I started avoiding her texts, knowing that whatever she had to say would make me feel worse, not better. But even as I pulled away, I felt the ache of her absence. Losing Emily wasn't just about losing a friend. It was about losing the only person who made me feel like I belonged. I told myself I was done with people like her, but deep down I knew the truth. I needed someone. Anyone. And that's when I met Luke. Luke wasn't like the other boys at school. He was quiet, almost brooding, with a messy mop of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. He was the kind of boy who sat in the back of the classroom, doodling in his notebook while the teacher lectured. I noticed him before he noticed me. We first spoke during lunch. I was sitting alone under the bleachers, picking at a peanut butter sandwich when he walked up. "You always sit here?" he asked, his voice low but warm. I shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "It's quiet." He nodded, sliding down to sit beside me. For a while neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkward though. It felt easy. "I like quiet," he finally said, pulling out a sketch pad. I watched as he began to draw, his pencil moving with practiced ease. It was a picture of the bleachers, but somehow the way he shaded and shaped the lines made them look alive. "That's amazing," I said without thinking. He glanced at me, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Thanks." For the first time in a long while I didn't feel invisible. It wasn't long before Luke and I became inseparable. He'd wait for me after class, walk me home and send me texts late into the night. With him I didn't feel like too much. He seemed to like the parts of me I usually tried to hide. The nervous energy, the endless questions, the way I'd get lost in my own thoughts. Our first date wasn't anything fancy. He took me to the park where we sat on a blanket under the stars, sharing a bag of chips and talking about everything and nothing. "I feel like I've known you forever," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. Luke looked at me, his expression soft. "Maybe you have. Maybe we're just finding each other again." The way he said it made me shiver, like he'd reached into my chest and touched something fragile and hidden. That night he kissed me. It wasn't my first kiss, but it was the first one that felt real. His lips were soft, his hands gentle as they cradled my face. For a moment the emptiness inside me seemed to fade, replaced by something warm and fleeting. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered promises. Luke was my world and I was his. At least that's what I wanted to believe. I threw myself into the relationship with everything I had. I texted him constantly, needing to know where he was, what he was doing, if he was thinking about me. When he didn't respond right away, I felt a gnawing anxiety that I couldn't explain. "Are you okay?" he asked one day after I'd called him 3 times in a row. I don't want to lose you," I admitted, my voice trembling. Luke frowned, his brow furrowing. "You're not going to lose me, Susan." I wanted to believe him. But part of me couldn't. It started small. A missed text here, a cancelled date there. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was overthinking things. But the doubts crept in anyway, like shadows stretching across the corners of my mind. One night he forgot to call me back. I sat on my bed staring at my phone, my heart pounding. By the time he finally called, my emotions were already spiraling. "Hey," he said, his tone casual, like nothing was wrong. "Where were you?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Luke hesitated. "I was with my mom. She needed help with something. I knew I should have let it go, but I couldn't." "You couldn't text me? I've been sitting here waiting." "I'm sorry," he interrupted, his voice tinged with frustration. "But Susan, you can't expect me to check in every 5 minutes." His words stung and I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to explain that it wasn't about the text, not really. It was about the way his silence made me feel unimportant, like I didn't matter. But I didn't know how to say that without sounding crazy. So I apologized. And he forgave me. And we moved on. But the cracks in our relationship never really healed. As the months went on, our fights became more frequent. They always started the same way, with me feeling neglected, ignored, or unimportant, and ended with Luke apologizing just to calm me down. "I don't know what you want from me," he said one night after I accused him of flirting with another girl. "I want you to love me," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "I do love you," he replied, his voice weary. "But it's like nothing I do is ever enough for you." I hated how true his words felt. It happened on a rainy Saturday afternoon. We were sitting in his car, the windows fogged from the heat of our argument. "I can't do this anymore," Luke said, his voice trembling. My heart stopped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to break up. This isn't healthy, Susan." The world seemed to tilt around me and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "You don't mean that." But he did. When he drove away, leaving me standing in the rain, I felt like I was breaking apart. The emptiness I'd spent so long trying to fill came rushing back, swallowing me whole. In the days after Luke left, I became a shadow of myself. I replayed every moment of our relationship in my mind, dissecting it, trying to find the exact moment it all went wrong. Was it the night I accused him of flirting? The time I showed up unannounced at his house? Or was it something deeper? Something broken inside me that no one could fix? For years I'd craved connection, a kind of closeness I could never quite grasp. Luke had felt like my chance to finally have that, to fill the void that had been with me since I was a little girl. And now that he was gone, the emptiness was back, sharper and deeper than ever. I told myself it was just a breakup, that everyone went through this. But it wasn't the same, not for me. When I cried, it wasn't just about Luke. It was about every time I'd been left behind, by my dad, by my mom when she was too lost in her own pain to see me, by Emily, and now by Luke. It was a pattern, a story I'd been living my whole life. The truth was, Luke hadn't just been my boyfriend. He'd been my anchor, my proof that I could be loved. Without him, I felt like I was floating, untethered and lost. It wasn't until years later, when I began to understand myself better, that I could reflect on why my relationship with Luke had consumed me so completely. At the time, all I knew was that I'd wanted him in a way that felt almost desperate, like if I could just hold on to him tightly enough, he could fix everything wrong with me. That desperation was there from the start, even before we kissed, even before we went on that first date. It was there the night of my first sexual encounter. It happened on a warm summer evening, a few months after Luke and I had started dating. We were lying on a blanket in the park, the stars scattered above us like tiny shards of glass. Luke was tracing circles on the back of my hand, his touch gentle and deliberate. "Do you ever feel like you're not enough?" I asked suddenly, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, the words tangled in my throat. Like no matter what you do, people always want more. Like you're too much and not enough at the same time. Luke didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned closer, his forehead brushing against mine. "You're not too much, Susan," he said softly. "You're perfect." In that moment, I wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. When he kissed me, I didn't pull away. His hands moved slowly, tentatively, as if he were waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. I didn't stop him when he slid his hands under my shirt or when he whispered, "Are you sure?" I wasn't sure, not really. But I nodded anyway because I wanted to feel close to him, to feel wanted. That night, as we lay tangled together on the blanket, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, vulnerability, and an ache I couldn't name. For a brief moment, I thought I'd finally found what I was looking for: connection, intimacy, love. But as the days passed, the feeling faded, replaced by something heavier. I started analyzing every interaction between us, searching for signs that he felt differently about me. Did he seem more distant? Less affectionate? Was he losing interest now that we'd crossed that line? When Luke noticed my unease, he tried to reassure me. "Susan, nothing's changed," he said, his hands resting on my shoulders. "I still love you." But I didn't believe him. Not fully. Looking back, I understand why I felt the way I did. My first sexual experience wasn't about desire or passion. It was about longing. I wasn't just trying to connect with Luke. I was trying to prove to myself that I could be loved, that I could be enough. But no matter how close we got, it never felt like enough. That's the thing about longing. It's not just about what you want. It's about what you think you'll never have. For me, that was love. Not just romantic love, but unconditional love, the kind that doesn't waver or fade. The kind I never got from my parents. The kind I didn't know how to give to myself. After Luke, I told myself I'd learned my lesson. I swore I'd never let anyone get that close again, not in the way that left me feeling so exposed, so raw. But promises like that are easy to make and impossible to keep. I craved intimacy even when it scared me. Even when I knew it wouldn't end well. For me, intimacy wasn't just about being physically close to someone. It was about the unspoken things, the spaces between words, the way someone's presence could make me feel less alone. But it was also dangerous because every time I let someone in, I handed them the power to hurt me. And they always did. The relationships that followed Luke were like echoes of that first heartbreak, each one louder and more destructive than the last. It always started the same way. An intense connection, almost electric. They'd say something clever or look at me in a way that made me feel like I was the only person in the room and I'd be hooked. The beginning was always intoxicating. The late-night conversations, the shared secrets, the way they'd hold my hand like they never wanted to let go. But it never stayed that way. I'd idealized them at first, seeing only the good, ignoring the red flags that waved so clearly in front of me. To me, they were perfect, capable of filling the emptiness inside me, of fixing the broken parts one couldn't repair myself. But the pedestal I put them on was precarious. The first crack would come, a missed call, a forgotten promise, a moment of distance, and my mind would spiral. Did they still care about me? Were they bored? Was I too much for them? The fear of abandonment was overwhelming. I'd cling tighter, demanding more, needing constant reassurance. And when they couldn't give me what I needed, or when they pulled away, I'd lash out. Sometimes it was anger, sharp and cutting. Other times, it was desperation, begging them to stay even as I knew I was driving them further away. Sex became another way for me to seek reassurance. It wasn't about the act itself. It was about what it represented. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered word felt like proof that I was wanted, needed. For those fleeting moments, I could convince myself that I was whole, that the emptiness inside me didn't matter. But afterward, the doubts would creep in. Did they really mean it when they said they loved me? Or were they just saying what I wanted to hear? Would they still want me in the morning? And when they inevitably left, because they always did, it felt like confirmation of everything I feared about myself. By my late 20s, I started to see the pattern. I wasn't blind to it. In fact, I was painfully aware of how my relationships always seemed to implode in the same way. But knowing didn't make it easier to stop. I'd tell myself to take things slow, to not rush into anything, to keep my emotions in check. And for a while I could manage it. But the moment I felt that spark, that connection, it was like all my resolve melted away. I wanted so badly to be loved, to be seen, to be understood. But the more I reached for it, the further it seemed to slip from my grasp. Every breakup left me a little more fractured, a little more convinced that love wasn't meant for someone like me. I'd swear off relationships, telling myself I was better off alone. But the loneliness was unbearable. The emptiness gnawed at me, a constant reminder of what I didn't have, what I couldn't seem to hold on to. So I'd try again. And again. Each time I'd hope it would be different. That this person would be the one to stay, the one who could see past my flaws and love me anyway. But it was never different. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever break the cycle. If I'll ever learn how to love without losing myself, how to let someone in without giving them the power to destroy me. I've tried to understand myself, to untangle the knots of my past and figure out why I am the way I am. But the answers, when they come, are rarely comforting. I know my childhood shaped me. I know the fear of abandonment I carry is rooted in those early years, in the love I didn't receive, in the wounds that never properly healed. But knowing isn't the same as fixing. Sometimes late at night I lie awake and imagine a different life. One where I'm not afraid to let people in, where I can love and be loved without fear. I don't know if that life is possible for me. But I want to believe it is. Because despite everything, I still believe in love. I believe in connection. I believe in the possibility of healing, even if I don't know how to find it yet. By the time I met Barry, I was 28 and tired. Tired of searching, tired of failing, tired of carrying the weight of my own brokenness. I wasn't looking for a relationship when he walked into my life. If anything, I was trying to avoid one. But Barry had a way of making himself impossible to ignore. He was charming in a quiet, unassuming way, with a warm smile and a calmness that felt like the opposite of everything I was. When he spoke, people listened, not because he demanded their attention but because his words carried weight. For reasons I couldn't explain, he saw me. Really saw me. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party, one of those awkward gatherings where everyone is a little too polite and the conversation feels forced. I was sitting alone in the corner, nursing a glass of wine and debating whether to leave, when Barry sat down beside me. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said, his voice warm and teasing. I glanced at him, surprised. Is it that obvious? He smiled, leaning back in his chair. A little. But don't worry, I'm not a fan of these things either. That was how it started. A shared dislike of dinner parties and a quiet conversation that lasted long after everyone else had gone home. Barry had a way of making me feel at ease, like I didn't have to try so hard to be interesting or likable. He listened when I spoke, really listened, and when he laughed at my jokes it didn't feel forced. For the first time in years I didn't feel like too much. Barry and I fell into a rhythm quickly. He'd call me after work to ask about my day, bring me coffee when I was too busy to leave my desk, and hold my hand in a way that made me feel grounded. It wasn't just the big gestures that made me fall for him. It was the little things. The way he remembered my favorite tea, or how he'd sit with me in comfortable silence when I couldn't find the words to explain what I was feeling. For the first few months, I was convinced I'd finally found what I'd been searching for. But the thing about cycles is that they don't break just because you want them to. It started subtly the way it always did. Barry would forget to reply to a text, or cancel plans at the last minute because work ran late. On the surface it wasn't a big deal, nothing worth fighting over. But to me it felt like the beginning of the end. I tried to ignore the creeping doubts, but they grew louder with each passing day. Was he losing interest? Was I not enough for him? One night, after he canceled dinner for the third time in a week, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Do you even want to be with me?" I blurted out, my voice shaking. Barry looked at me startled. "What? Of course I do. Then why do I feel like you don't?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Susan, you can't expect me to be perfect all the time. I'm doing the best I can." I hated how reasonable he sounded, how calm. It only made me feel more unhinged. Our fights became more frequent after that. They always followed the same pattern. I'd accuse him of not caring enough, he'd reassure me, and for a while things would be okay. But the reassurance never lasted. I couldn't stop myself from testing him, pushing him to prove his love over and over again. And the more I pushed, the more he pulled away. "I feel like I'm walking on eggshells with you," he said one night, his voice heavy with frustration. "I just need to know that you care," I replied, tears streaming down my face. "I do care, Susan. But I can't keep proving it every single day. It's exhausting." His words cut deep, not because they were cruel but because they were true. The breaking point came on a rainy Sunday afternoon. We were sitting on his couch, the silence between us thick with unspoken tension. "I can't do this anymore," Barry said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart sank. "What do you mean?" "I mean this. Us. It's not healthy. I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough for you." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down I knew he was right. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know you are," he replied, his eyes soft but resolute. "But I think we need to take a step back. For both of our sakes." Losing Barry hurt, but it wasn't the same kind of pain I'd felt with others before him. This time, there was a quiet understanding beneath the heartbreak, a recognition that I'd played a part in our downfall. Barry wasn't perfect, but he had tried. He had cared. And I had pushed him away. 4 weeks after the breakup, I replayed our relationship in my mind, dissecting every argument, every misstep. I told myself I would learn from it, that I'd do better next time. But deep down I wasn't sure I could. Because the truth was, I didn't know how to be in a relationship without losing myself, or demanding too much from the other person. Losing Barry felt different from the others. He wasn't just another heartbreak, he was a mirror. In the months after our breakup, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. "It's not healthy." He was right. And for the first time I couldn't just blame the other person or chalk it up to bad luck. I had to face the fact that something inside me wasn't working. Not just in my relationships but in how I lived my life. It was about 6 months after Barry and I ended things. I'd spent most of that time avoiding people, cycling through brief moments of resolve to get my life together, and sinking back into the familiar pit of loneliness. One evening, a coworker invited me to a party. I didn't want to go. Crowds always made me feel out of place, but she was insistent. "You need to get out of your head, Susan," she said, handing me the invitation. "It'll be fun." Fun wasn't the word I'd have used. The party was loud and chaotic, the kind of scene where everyone seemed to know each other except me. I hovered near the edges of the room, nursing a drink and debating how soon I could leave without seeming rude. That's when I saw her. She was standing by the window, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. There was something magnetic about her, a quiet confidence that made it impossible to look away. Our eyes met and she smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a jolt through me. Before I could talk myself out of it, I walked over. Her name was Lauren. She worked in publishing, loved old movies, and had a laugh that made me feel lighter somehow. We talked for hours, the party fading into the background. She was direct in a way that caught me off guard, asking questions most people avoided. "What do you want, Susan?" she asked at one point, her eyes searching mine. I hesitated, the answer stuck in my throat. "I don't know," I admitted finally. Lauren didn't judge me for it. He just nodded like she understood. Over the next few weeks, Lauren and I became friends. Real friends, not the kind built on surface-level niceties. She had a way of cutting through my defenses, calling me out on my self-destructive tendencies without making me feel attacked. One night, after I'd shared a particularly chaotic story about my past, she gave me a long, thoughtful look. "You ever think about why you do this to yourself?" she asked. "Do what?" "Get stuck in these cycles. Pushing people away, pulling them back in. It's like you're afraid to let anyone actually stay." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. No one had ever put it so plainly before. "I'm not afraid," I said, though my voice wavered. "Aren't you?" Lauren countered. "You say you want love, but the second someone gets too close, you sabotage it. Maybe it's not them you don't trust. It's yourself." I spent days turning Lauren's words over in my mind, replaying every relationship I'd ever had. Was it true? Was I the one who couldn't let people stay? The answer was painful to admit, but undeniable. I'd spent so much of my life chasing connection, yet every time I found it, I destroyed it. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to hold on to it without losing myself. Lauren's friendship didn't fix me, but it gave me something I hadn't had before. A mirror that reflected the truth, not just the version of myself I wanted to see. She didn't sugarcoat things or let me off the hook, but she also didn't abandon me when I messed up. For the first time, I started to see that maybe love didn't have to be all or nothing. One evening, after another long conversation about life and relationships, Lauren said something that stuck with me. "You're not broken, Susan," she said softly. "You're just carrying a lot of things that aren't yours to carry. Maybe it's time to put some of them down." Her words felt like a lifeline, a small but powerful reminder that I wasn't doomed to repeat the same mistakes forever. Lauren's words stayed with me. Maybe it's time to put some of them down. For weeks I wrestled with what that meant. What did it look like to let go of the things I'd carried for so long? How do you even begin to untangle the threads of your own pain, to separate what's yours from what isn't? The idea of changing felt monumental, like trying to climb a mountain barefoot. But for the first time in my life, I felt like it might be worth trying. I started with the smallest of steps. When I felt the familiar pang of anxiety, the urge to text someone for reassurance, to demand proof that I wasn't being abandoned, I forced myself to pause. Just for a moment. Lauren had suggested keeping a journal, so I started writing down my thoughts instead of acting on them. At first, it felt awkward, like I was talking to myself. But as the pages filled up, I began to see patterns. The fear was always the same. The voices in my head always whispered the same things. "They don't care about you. You're too much. You're going to be alone forever." But writing them down made them feel less powerful, like I was taking them out of the shadows and holding them up to the light. Progress wasn't linear, though. It never is. One night, after weeks of relative calm, I found myself spiraling again. It was something small. A friend canceled plans at the last minute, but it sent me into a tailspin. The old feelings came rushing back. The panic, the anger, the suffocating fear of being abandoned. I spent hours pacing my apartment, my thoughts racing in circles. By the time I sat down, my hands were shaking. That's when I saw it. The knife on the counter, still out from dinner. The scene felt eerily familiar. The dim light, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the way the knife glinted in the pale light. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It wasn't about wanting to die. It wasn't even about the pain. It was about control. About silencing the chaos inside me, even if just for a moment. But this time something was different. Lauren's voice echoed in my mind. You're not broken, Susan. You're just carrying a lot of things that aren't yours to carry. And suddenly I felt an overwhelming wave of sadness. Not for the people who had hurt me, but for myself. For the little girl who had been left to fend for herself. For the teenager who thought love was the only way to feel whole. For the woman standing in her kitchen, holding a knife, trying to quiet the storm inside her. I set the knife down. I sat on the floor, my back against the cabinets, and cried until my chest ached. And when the tears finally stopped, I made a decision. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It didn't feel like a revelation. But it was real, and it was mine. I needed help. Not from a friend or a lover or a fleeting connection. I needed real help. Someone who could guide me through the labyrinth of my own mind, who could help me understand why I felt the way I did, and how to change it. The next morning, I looked up therapists in my area. It took hours to find someone who seemed like the right fit, and even then I hesitated before sending the email. But I did it. The response came quickly, a short message offering a time for an initial session. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever before replying, confirming the appointment. The day of the session, I sat in the waiting room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to expect or what I was supposed to say. When the therapist called my name, I almost didn't get up. But then I thought about Lauren, about Barry, about the knife on the counter. I thought about the life I wanted, the one where I wasn't ruled by fear and doubt, where I could love and be loved without tearing myself apart. And I stood up. That first session was just the beginning. There was no quick fix, no magical moment where everything fell into place. But it was a start. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was choosing myself. Not the version of me I thought other people wanted, but the messy, imperfect, real me. And as I left the therapist's office, stepping into the crisp afternoon air, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Because healing wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time I believed it was possible.
Thanks for watching Psych Tales. We hope today's story gave you new insights into the fascinating world of psychological disorders. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe for more enlightening stories. Together, let's continue exploring the mind, one tale at a time. See you in the next episode.